Pressman. I am a board member for ELO. My book on digital literature called Digital Modernism, Making It New and New Media came out this year. And my collection with Kate Hales called Comparative Textual Media, Transforming the Humanities in a Post-Print Era, also just came out and has some essays by people in our field. Today I'm going to be sharing research that I've been working on for the past few years. So for the past few years, I've been tracing an aesthetic strategy that I call bookishness, wherein in the moment of the book's supposed demise and obsolescence, we see the proliferation of creative acts of fetishizing the book artifact. The return to the book object happens across countries, languages, genres, and media forms, and it runs the spectrum from high art to absolute kitsch. This particular sort of bibliophilia is not about reading or literature or literacy. It's about signifying the technologies through which knowledge happened. Because bookishness signals and expresses the medial shift from pages to screens, and moreover, how we're actually grappling with this change. Bookishness makes visible the book's body. Indeed, it makes it impossible not to see how materiality matters, and how a medial shift away from books must have deep cultural significance. So today, I'm going to focus on how electronic literature, that absolutely non-codexical literary form, how it employs bookishness to engage with the question of the medial shift. And bookish art suggests that the medial transition is not just about technology, but also about value judgments, and specifically aesthetic categories, the social, political, even gendered ideologies involved in determining what is valued and what is not. For when we distinguish between art and craft, between cute and beautiful, we make judgments not only about the objects at hand, but also about our culture's value system in general. So, the important part of my title's talk today was actually left off of the conference program, and I want to show it, because the talk today is really not about aesthetics per se. It's about the purposeful appropriation of them for feminist activity. Indeed, the title bookish is a bit inaccurate, because I'm not talking about books or even bookness, but about paper and electronic literature. But the fact remains that electronic literature is awash in paper. Many recent works of e-lit remediate paper and paper forms. But there's a subset of work by women that does more than just adapt paper forms for the screen. These works archive and illuminate the arts associated with paper, and indeed the people behind the craft, women. So the paper arts of scrapbooking, dress-up dolls, tabletop theater, and sewing prominently appear in these works, in their backgrounds, in their plots, and their conceptual designs. And I want to argue that there's something different and distinct going on here in this remediation of paper by women writers. And I want to suggest that they employ the aesthetic of bookishness to pursue a strategic feminist and thus political purpose. The goal is to archive the obsolete media art by exhibiting and updating it, and thus paying tribute to the paper-based arts of women and domesticity, because such handiwork is usually of the female domain and is commonly valued as craft, not as art. So these works implicitly critique such value judgments, and today I follow them in doing so. Now, it's important to note that paper is not the same thing as a book, right? And paperwork is not bookishness. Lisa Gittleman makes this fact brilliantly in the essay that she wrote for the collection, wherein she focuses on non-codex forms of paper to make the argument these are often, always overlooked when we talk about print culture. And yet, there's a wave of scholarly interest, often in book form, in paper as a medium and the history of paper. And this does coincide with, I would argue, bookishness. Because bookishness is actually less about books per se than about their materiality or their artifactuality, which includes, of course, paper. So when I see screens presenting digital literature atop remediated paper, I can't help but wonder why, right? We all know that electronic literature is not book-based, but we also know that the remediation of books has been part of the evolution of computing and of ELIT from the beginning. Sometimes this is due to a failure of imagination. Think of Johanna Drucker's great critique of e-reader's interface. But it's also, at times, remediation is used strategically, like the turning page function in the Kindle, the skeuomorph that transitions readers from page to a new reading device. And the works that I discussed today pursue the latter, pursue bookishness as a strategy. So here's a few of the works. In very different ways, but with meaningful and shared connections, Caitlin Fisher, Travis Albert, J.R. Carpenter, and Juliet Davis all purposely pursue the remediation of female domestic paper arts. These writers employ media archaeology as an aesthetic tool, and they use digital poetics to recuperate earlier artistic practices and in the process argue for the significance of them. So for example, Christine Wilkes' Fitting the Pattern is an obvious example of feminist bookishness. It's a memoir about a daughter's reflections on lessons learned from her seamstress mother. It's also an homage to the craft of sewing, and specifically the tools involved in it. So the reader proceeds by selecting a sewing tool and approaching the paper pattern. Your movements elicit text. You read by sewing, and you learn by doing. Now, weaving has been a central metaphor of electronic literature since early hypertext. Think of Shelley Jackson's Patchwork Girl. And of course, it's also been a central metaphor in literature from its beginnings. Think of the etymology of text, right, the Latin root. But Wilkes uses sewing not just to invoke metaphors of bodies as assemblages in a Butlerian sense, right, of performance of genders, like Shelley Jackson, but also to illuminate the actual media forms and the gendered bodies involved in the process of stitching. So as the work's title suggests, its focal point is the paper pattern that is the foundation for creating a piece of clothing and is also the backdrop for creating the memories of the story. So Fitting the Pattern is very much about bringing to view the discardable paper patterns behind the lost art of homemade clothes, an art form historically performed by women, right? And focusing on the pattern, recuperating its paper into the digital, thus serves a feminist purpose. Now I could spend a lot more time on this little gem of work, but I want to move on to explore bookishness and a few others, and then try to, and do so quickly because I want to try and make an argument for why reading them together actually matters. So Travis Albert has been pursuing bookishness across multiple works for a long time, and they're utterly nostalgic for paper arts and memorabilia. In the case of Dandelion Chance, she uses postcards and a travel notebook, paper tools that create a soulful meditation on a modern woman's freedom to move across places, but also be displaced by this movement. In Who is Flora? She uses old postcards to tell the story of a woman traveling across the states in the 1940s. This work refashions for the web the stylized art of postcards and saves their aesthetic and remixes the voice of Flora with that of the author's own. In 30 Days of Rain, it's scrapbooking and fold-over paper calendars. Albert's works highlight the ephemeral paper arts of recording memories and of marking time, and they also show how these paper practices continue into the digital age by becoming cute, fetishized, and nostalgic. Now, these terms are usually used to discount a work of literature and art, to signify that it is not serious, beautiful, or good, right? But I want to argue that this cute shtick in bookishness is actually really important. And I'm going to do so by relying on Sian Nai's recent examination of Ugly Feelings and her really amazing book, if you haven't seen it, Our Aesthetic Categories, which recuperates and examines undervalued aesthetic categories of the cute, the zany, and the interesting. Now, much of electronic literature would fall under Nai's category for merely interesting, which I used to take offense to, but now I understand, which she aligns with conceptual art. But I'm going to focus here instead on the category of the cute, as it applies to the bookish works I just showcased. Because calling something cute usually denotes dismissal, right? And it's usually aligned with feminized and infantilizing push to the margins. But Nye deconstructs this category and the categorical judgment of cuteness in ways that make us reconsider its significance. She argues that far from being the opposite of serious art, cuteness has an important place in avant-garde poetry, specifically since modernism. And we can see cuteness operating in this short poems like William Carlos Williams' is super cute. This is just to say, it's a poem, right? Or in its focus on domesticity in Stein's Tender Buttons. And Nye traces the history of cuteness in aesthetic theory and shows that it emerged as a judgment in 19th century America in the development of American mass culture and commodity fetishism, when Marx is describing it, right, and critiquing it, and when the commodity loses its use value. And in this context, cuteness came to express how human producers of commodities come to fetishize the commodities themselves. They become cute, right? This is when cute also takes on a negative tinge, she argues, and becomes aligned with the negative affects of smallness, vulnerability, softness, qualities aligned with the female. So Nye contrasts cute with the beautiful, right, the ultimate aesthetic category, calling the cute, quote, a response to the familiar, homey objects, end quote. So cute is part of the domestic. And she states, quote, cuteness contains none of beauty's oft-noted references to novelty, singularity, or what Adorno calls the sphere of untouchability, end quote. So the cute's not about the autonomous, okay, but it's instead about power relations. It's about the aestheticization of powerlessness. Cute becomes and promotes the desire to have a thing, to hold it, to own it, to control it. This is why cuteness is very much about and even rises out of commodity culture. Now, her argument is really far more robust than what I just presented, so take that and go read the book. But now I want to explain why I'm using it, right, for bookishness and for e-lit. Because cuteness expresses a desire for intimacy with commodities, like this cute bookish necklace, which I really want. It participates in facilitating post-industrial mass consumer culture and the role of the avant-garde in it. So while Nye traces the role of cuteness in avant-garde poetry, I'd like to suggest that we can see something similar in bookish electronic literature. To do so, let me turn to a final and very fulfilling example, Caitlin Fisher's Circle, which is totally amazing. She's here. The work is very much, I hope we'll see. I did this with Amaranth too. I gave this reading. I was like, see what I think. This work is very much about artifactuality and cuteness. It's an augmented reality work that adapts and updates the art of tabletop theater, and it has gone through different iterations of software programs, but all of its versions operate by attaching encoded markers to paper and or actual objects. And when the reader's computer scans the markers, the story appears in little vignettes that tell the relationship about 3 generations of women. So the reader interacts with little things, cute little things, selecting them, holding them, touching them, in order to access their stories.
My name is Rachel. A flamenco dancer. You can still hear it beating. Harriet wants to make a little birds.
The objects in Circle are cute little things that contain and project memories, literally. They have agency, right? And thus they depict Nye's claim that, quote, cuteness seems always to include a fantasy of agency of its hyper-objectified objects, end quote. So there's something going here on. It's not just the holder, the reader, the owner having power of the cute objects. It's a dialectic of power, right? So these cute things don't just exert power over us. They compel us to handle them in a certain way. They teach us to do so that we can read and access the stories they contain. The objects in Circle draw attention to themselves as having meaning and having value, right? They have personal, not marketplace value. And they thus suggest commentary on what counts as value and as valuable. So Caitlin Fisher's Circle uses digital technology to animate these little paper, domestic, female objects. And in so doing, the work shows the aesthetic category of cuteness at work and in electronic literature. So today I focused on works of electronic literature that remediate paper-based arts that are becoming obsolete due to digital technologies, art forms that are historically and culturally gendered female. These works use digital technology to recuperate and represent the older paper practices, and the result is as much political as aesthetic. They promote reconsideration and revaluing of women's crafts. They perform acts of critical deconstruction along the line of CN9's critique of our aesthetic categories. Right? So they're putting it into practice, is what I'm arguing. The results are works of electronic literature that may seem merely cute, but are also deeply important to understanding how and why we judge and comprehend. So like Nye, these female writers excavate and examine the discarded scraps, the sewing patterns and paper dolls. And they make visible these things as well as the aesthetic judgments that allowed them to fall into obsolescence. These paper crafts become visible, and yes, even beautiful. This is bookishness, and it is also, in this case, feminism. So for a conference whose theme is Hold the Light, Identity, Change, and Commitment, and whose focus is distinguishing what we do, it seems particularly important to point out that when we talk about aesthetics, we're never just talking about art objects and feelings. We're talking about cultural, historical, departmental, institutional commitments. Cute is never just cute. And the aesthetic of bookishness is never just about books, paper, or nostalgia. It's about making visible and thus open to critique the values we impose on the bodies of texts and of people. Thanks.